Welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city, the City of Five Flags. In several recent episodes, we've been talking about the life and times of Pensacola's people during World War I. And in the course of that, we've touched upon a number of things that people did and the way how they responded. We saw the evolution of our great naval air station. We saw the presence then of a great shipyard, which was operated out on our west side. We saw the beginning of the wonderful Sacred Heart Hospital and what it was able to do for people here. We saw how we responded to hundreds of men and women being inducted into the military service, inducted or volunteering. Almost 2,000 people from Pensacola participated in World War I before we were. So we saw how people here were using food as a weapon, and what a wonderful job they did with that. And of course, we talked about how people pooled together and raised money in the Liberty Loan drives, paying for the war, if you will. And of course, then we sort of climaxed the story with the terrible influenza epidemic, which came right at the end of World War I, and which affected a great number of people here and worldwide. Now, beyond that, we come to the end of the war, and of course, there was an armistice affecting basically the relationship with Germany, because before the war ended, Austria and the other German allies were already out of the war. It was not necessary to create an armistice for them. They had stopped fighting already. The armistice laid out what the Germans were going to have to do, as admitting that they had been responsible for basically the beginning of the war. This was maybe not quite the truth, but nonetheless, that was the way it was stated. The Germans agreed to give up all of their basic military hardware and to pay a sum in excess of $55 billion to pay for the damage that they had done to other parts of Europe. And that's the way the armistice was written. Now came the deal of writing peace treaties. And the question was, of course, Mr. Wilson, our president, was determined that the 14 points that he had written, which he hoped would lead to an honorable peace for all parties, these had been written in February of 1918. He hoped that this was going to be the basis of an honorable set of treaties affecting all of the interested parties. And so he put together a game plan for this. And the ones who were going to negotiate on behalf of the United States were Wilson himself and a friend named Edward House. In history, he's called Colonel House. He's sort of like some of those Kentucky colonels. I don't believe he ever put on a uniform for anyone, but he was a very trusted advisor that the president loved to have with him. And these two men went off into 1919. They went across the ocean to begin the negotiations. Now, at this point in time, the negotiators from the other parties were these. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England, was their negotiator. The head of the government in France, Clemenceau, was going to be negotiating for them, and Georges Orlando was representing Italy. Now, sitting around the conference table talking about the terms of the armistice, or the terms of the treaties, there was no representative from Germany, no representative from Austria. The four major allies were going to make all of the decisions. And so they began meeting with one another casually, informally, for about 2 months. And so it was January before the actual conference began. And what Wilson, of course, began to realize right off the bat was that he was dealing with three men who represented countries, each of which had its own agenda. They knew what they wanted to come out of this set of treaties. Whether those ideas conformed in any way to Wilson's 14 points, he was soon to learn that, to his dismay and his displeasure, that these people weren't interested in the 14 points, so they began to talk one after the other. And here's basically, as things went forward, here are the things that finally were decided. Number one, Germany was going to give up the territory, the Alsace and Lorraine on the eastern part of their current boundary that they had taken from France at the end of the war in 1871. That was to go back to France. Then other segments of Germany were going to be taken off here and there on the southeast and then the northeast. These were going to be put together, number one, to create a new country. This was going to become Czechoslovakia. On the northeast of Germany, a new Poland was going to come into being, because Poland had been pretty much swallowed up in prior activities in the past century. But now we were going to have a new Poland with a deep water port at the very top of it there, the city of Danzig. So Germany was giving up all of that territory. Austria was giving up some as well, so that a new country would be formed to the southeast of Austria. This was going to put together Serbia, Montenegro, and some other slivers that came from Austria. This was going to create a new land, a new state. This is what we, as in their days, recent past, we called Yugoslavia. So all of this was forming. At this point in time, in the early stages of the discussion, they cared nothing in the world. They didn't talk about the Middle East at all, even though that had been a very big part of the activities at the very beginning of the war. So Wilson begins to negotiate. And step by step, he suddenly realizes that he is getting nowhere. For every decision that is made, that is put down, that is agreed to and positive, he's had to give up one or more of his 14 points. One after the other is given up. And as that happens, of course, he is just becoming totally frustrated all the way through. I think it's honest to say by the time they finished the negotiations that he and the other three members totally disliked one another. But nonetheless, that was basically what he was getting. Now, the Italians, of course, had their own little agenda. They wanted, when they got into the war, and they agreed to go into the war, they wanted territory in the upper right-hand corner of Italy, if you can visualize it that way from the map. They wanted part of the area up in the northeastern Alps, that they're on their northern border, and they wanted the city on the water there of Trieste. And the Italians got everything that they asked for in that point. The French, of course, they wanted to get, as I mentioned, they wanted to get Alsace and Lorraine back, which they did. And of course, the reparations were supposed to take care of the damages that they had suffered over 4 years of war. So that's basically the way things were. The Middle Eastern areas were hardly touched. And we have to spend just a minute talking about how that was ultimately going to come to pass. I believe we mentioned this a little bit in one of the earlier episodes, but bear in mind this way. Back in early 1915, the English had discovered that they lacked one of the fundamental chemicals for manufacturing gunpowder. And they were in desperate straits for this. And as that happened, a leading chemist in their society, a man named John Weizmann, came to the Prime Minister, Mr. Balfour, and said, "I've got a formula that will do just what you want, and I won't sell it to you. I will give it to the English people for my part of the war. However, I want something in return. I want an agreement from you that when the war is ended, that England will back the position of the Jewish people for a homeland in Palestine." And Mr. Balfour, the Prime Minister, at that point agreed that that would be the case, and that was the way this became known as the Balfour Declaration. At the very same time, another English officer by the name of T.E. Lawrence was beginning to organize a number of the Arab tribes to put together an armed force which would attack and do damage to the Turkish armies in the Middle East. And Lawrence, of course, he had become almost like an Arab himself. He was a very successful organizer. And what he had hoped to do was to dismantle the Turkish Empire and reestablish new countries that would have as their heads men who were the tribal leaders of the legitimate Arab states, rather than being the Sultan's henchmen who had been literally just given the situations that they had had before. And so Lawrence had this agreement, that he had made this agreement with the Arabian leaders, that once they had helped him put together their part in the battle against Turkey, he would make sure that when the treaty came along, when the settlements were made, that the Arab leaders would indeed have an opportunity to set up Arab states. And that was the agreement as it penned in the early part of the war. So that's the way things stood when they finished the negotiations on the treaty. Now, the last thing that was handing, of course, in the course of all this, was the number one thing for which Wilson had given away A, B, and C, and D, and that was the League of Nations. And Wilson just felt that this was for the future. The League was something that would protect the interests of all countries everywhere. You would have an organization would stand in favor of peace and would do things that were correct and honorable in the future. So Wilson said he gave up A, B, and C. And I want to take just a minute here, I think we have time in this episode, to give you some of the things that he gave up. Because this is part of his 14 points. Some had to deal with boundaries, some had to deal with the way people dealt with one another. First of all, he wanted to be sure that on the sea, on the seas. Absolute freedom of navigation would be available for anyone in peacetime and in war as well, except as the seas might be closed by international action. Secondly, he wanted to be sure that the way they settled all of these boundary disputes at the end of the war would be done with equity through trade. He wanted to be an absolute guarantee that national armaments would be reduced to the lowest possible level. He wanted to get away from what had been done in Germany and to a lesser estate in France before the war. He said, we don't need big armies. We don't need to spend millions and billions of dollars on armaments. Let's get down to a reasonable level. Then second, he said, when looking at what has happened in Russia, let's be sure that the territories on both sides are done. The settlement is made honorably, because the Germans took a great deal of land away from the Russians when their armistice was on. He wanted to make this certain that everyone was fair. Then he wanted to be sure that little Belgium, which had been so badly clawed at the very beginning of the war by Germany, wanted to be sure that everything went right for them. And then. There's just one or two more others down here. I want to read this one to you because it makes the point that I just mentioned a minute. He said he wanted that the Turkish portions of the Ottoman Empire to be assured, they would be assured a secure sovereignty, but the other nationalities under Turkish rule would be given free opportunity of autonomous development, and that the Dardanelles would be permanently opened to the free passage of ships from all nations. You see, Wilson was looking ahead to all of the things that he saw had been causes of war and that had been irritants between countries for years. He thought, now we've fought the war is over, we have everything in our hands to handle all this, let's be sure that we do it right. And that was his goal, and this is the way he had negotiated with the other three men. But as I mentioned just a minute ago, that it didn't quite work out that way, because the one after another, the things that, just as I've mentioned in here, they got to half solutions as far as Wilson was concerned. The Belgian problem, that was taken care of. The situation for Serbia and that one was reasonably taken care of. And of course, the French were happy with what they got. The Germans were unhappy all the way across. But that's basically the way things stood. Well, we finished the negotiations. We're now way into 1920. And the time has come to make sure that we get the treaty finally sent, because as is stated in our Constitution, the United States Senate has to be the one to sign off on a treaty of this kind. So Mr. Wilson comes back across the ocean, recognizing that he has not succeeded as far as his negotiations were concerned about on most of his points, but he has one thing that he feels that we still can cling to and for the permanent future, and that is the League of Nations. So he comes back prepared to hold a campaign with the Senate, so that their people would go with him, sign on the dotted line, and we would become part of the United Nations when it became effective. Now, the idea, of course, that all the participants, the allied participants, would be in most other countries. But interestingly enough, in the discussion, one of the points that Wilson gave up to the other three negotiators was that when the League of Nations would be founded, that Austria and Germany would not be members of the League. And so he didn't like that, but he felt maybe we could go back and renegotiate that at another point. But now he came back to the United States, and he and his associates said, okay, we'll have to sit down now with the Senate and see how they feel about it. Now, of course, the senators have been watching this go on all along, and you can imagine that there were differences of opinion there, too, as to how the United States react. This is an important treaty. We've spent money, we've spent lives, and what the Senate did and how Wilson reacted, well, that's our story when we come up with the next episode.